I'm at the University of Leeds, and I'm the director of the Timescapes Archive, and it's very much with that hat on that I'm going to be presenting today. So the presentation today, I'm going to be looking at qualitative secondary analysis as a form of methodological engagement. So that's very different from thinking about through methods of qualitative secondary analysis. For ease of use, I'm probably going to say QSA quite often. So QSA, qualitative secondary analysis. The presentation is in two parts. The first part is very theoretical, and the reason for that is that the development of qualitative secondary analysis has had very high theoretical stakes, and I think it's really important to engage with those. And in dealing with those theoretical ideas, I'm going to develop a new vocabulary for QSA. The second half of the presentation is going to be an empirical illustration, which I hope will make some of these theoretical ideas more accessible and easier to follow. So the key questions that I'm going to be looking at throughout this presentation, the sort of overarching questions, are how does thinking through QSA as a form of methodological engagement link to questions of evidence in qualitative research? I'm going to look at what new research relationships does QSA produce. And I'm also going to think through what existing relationships in the doing of research it reveals. So this part one is very much about definitions, controversies, and also developments in QSA. So what is qualitative secondary analysis? This is an absolute massive minefield. I think there's been quite a few people involved in these debates. It's a whole presentation in and of itself. But very simply, for the purposes of this morning's discussion, it's the qualitative analysis or reuse of existing data. It's usually qualitative research data that have been archived or found, but not necessarily. It could be any sort of data that are reused and that are treated in a qualitative way. And I'm focusing in this presentation on interview data held in archives, because that's been the focus of a lot of work and concern, but also it's this example, the empirical example that I use is on interview data. I think it's also worthwhile to think through why have methods of qualitative secondary analysis emerged. And I mean, this has been something characterizing the whole of this conference's program, is that a lot of people are engaging with different ways of reusing qualitative data. And a key driver here is the explosion of the digital data world. I mean, we are now in a digital world, you know, evidenced by this conference. And there has been a corresponding growth in international data infrastructures and investments. And I list a few examples here that are very specific to the UK context. As part of this, both in the forming of these infrastructures, but also in response to them, there has been this burgeoning of new methods. There's a major investment in qualitative longitudinal research and the building of the Timescapes archive some years ago. A key strand in that work that was led by Sarah Irwin was on the possibilities for reusing the data. Key figures in the debate have been people like Libby Bishop, Bren Neal. We've got a new language of big qual that's being led by Ros Edwards, Lynn Jamieson, Susie Weller, and Emma Davidson. And the particular language that I'm using of QSA is specific to work that I've done with Dr. Anna Tarrant and Professor Jason Hughes. And these methods, the development of these methods, have been supported and driven by European funding councils, who have increasingly insisted that we reuse valuable resources, data, that were extremely expensive to produce. All of you as qualitative researchers, you know how much time it takes to organise an interview, how much time it takes to conduct the interview, have it transcribed, analyse those data. Each interview is incredibly time intensive. So a qualitative data set is very expensive to produce, and it is a very valuable resource. And for me, it's qualitative data accrue value over time, and I'm going to explain why I think that in this presentation. So I mentioned earlier that there's, it's been quite fraught, and I'm going to talk through some early cautions that were raised about qualitative secondary analysis, because in the very early parts of the debates, the ideas were, well, right, okay, we can cobble qualitative data sets together and scale up. We can do all sorts of things and build big data with qualitative data in this very direct and straightforward way. And a paper which I think summarises beautifully some of the key difficulties with that way of thinking is the paper by Maudner et al. Here, and I give you the full reference. And the basis of the critique is that qualitative research is all about the particularities of context. So how can we use research data about contexts that have been removed from their contexts? And in this particular paper, they raise this critique around naive realism. I'm sorry about the banging and the noises here. So I think this is endemic to working from home in a global conference. So it's naive to think that data can be used without understanding the contextual details of their production. This is from the paper. And that findings are created through the interaction of particular researchers with particular respondents in particular locations and historical junctures. So we need to acknowledge this contextual embeddedness of data. They're not just bits of things, they're contextually embedded. And two key strands, I think, two key ideas that characterise this debate are around the distinction between primary and secondary research, primary and secondary researchers and data and analysis, where primary is part of the original team and secondary is where people reuse data, even if it's your own, even if you come at it from a distance. And in these debates around the difficulties of reusing data, there's a primacy that is given to being there in the originating research. And that being there gives us special insights. So those of you who've conducted qualitative fieldwork will recognise a lot of this. So there are these sensory insights that we get about the emotional dynamics of the research, where we get a feel for participants and the contextual details, what their living room looks like, what the bus route was like to get to their house, the locality where they live, what's on their mantelpiece, and those sorts of things. Also, as in primary, as it's formulated here, researchers have these formative opportunities in research, which are very much about changing, the research questions as the research continues, where researchers adapt to the circumstances of the research, what it is that participants say. They can formulate new questions, they can ask random questions in interview, and they can respond to the specific research dynamics of interviews themselves. There's also tacit contextual knowledge, which is unique to being there, which is perhaps derived from being part of the research, what sorts of conversations and debates and conferences were going on at the time, engaging with other people beyond those participants who produce the interviews, such as gatekeepers and stakeholders. And the researchers in the originating research have the privilege of historical immediacy. They're part of the era of that research. They're temporally in step with the participants. And through these things, interviews can be seen as a sort of unique data fingerprint, which are expressive of the particular relational and situated dynamics of the originating research. And I think that these things that they raise, these questions that they raise, or the points that they make, are really, really important. And this is my reading of the importance of these points. And it's because they get us to think about things like the temporal dynamics of research. So how research and data are sort of bound to these formative contexts of their becoming. These points also get us to think about the relational dynamics of research. So what our relationships are with people, our relationships with the data. They really begin to get us think through questions of how people produce data. The data are representative, they are produced, then they're not, then in a sense they're not found, they're not excavated from the social world. Through our engagement with the social world, we are productive of data in particular ways. And it also gets us to think through what it is that people actually do at interview. And this is going to be a key theme that I'm going to be picking up later on in the presentation. So these sorts of questions force us to engage with questions of engagement, the practice, the doing and theory in research. So data aren't just given to researchers, they're rendered as certain sorts of evidence. Data analysis is something that we do. And we need to think through forms of engagement in research production much more broadly. So it gets us away from those ideas that we can simply stroll into any study and use it as if we're on our own, use it in a very simplistic way as if it's our own. But there's a real problem with a lot of the critiques here, which is that QSA, and I think that this persists. I'm just thinking through conversations that I've had this year, in the past year, doing research through COVID, doing research at a remove, that QSA is commonly defined through deficit. What it doesn't allow us to do, it doesn't allow us to get close to participants, it doesn't allow us these sorts of formative capacities, it doesn't allow the sights, sounds and smells and so on and so forth. And this is my point of departure, that it's only defined in terms of deficit. So in response to these early cautions, Jennifer Mason, in a special issue that she produced for Sociological Research Online, developed ideas of reflexive epistemology, where the shift in thinking around QSA is from whether you can to how you can. And there's a key paper in there by Neve Moore on primary and secondary that I would encourage you to go and have a look. It was a real landmark paper on shifting our thinking around primary and secondary data. And in the work of Sarah Irwin and Mandy Winterton under timescales that I mentioned earlier, they state, well, primary analysts may have this privileged relationship to the data that they've generated, in terms of all these affordances of primacy. But that doesn't necessarily mean they have this privileged claim on the arguments that can be made from that data. There are other arguments that we can make. So I'm taking these ideas forward and arguing that QSA gives us something different. It gives us different sorts of analytic opportunities, but we need to know what they are and understand what it is that QSA gives us. And in addressing these questions, I'm beginning to introduce this language of degrees and blends and balances, of proximity and remove. And what I would say here is that proximity and remove does not map onto primary and secondary. It isn't the same thing. Proximity and remove relates very specifically to the sorts of relationships that we have with each other, with research, with the data, and so on and so forth. And that's what I'm going to go through in this presentation. So just to start with, I would argue that all research involves some form of proximity and remove from the formative context of research. So for example, when we think about interviews, there's a temporal distance that's been travelled from the beginning to the end. So even in very tiny temporal scales, we're always moving through time. Time is always passing. So there's always a degree, different degrees of temporal proximity and remove. Also, researchers coming back to data 3 months down the line will be coming and finding new things. There's always this process of return, reconnection and consideration, and you yourselves, at whatever stage of research that you're engaged in, are engaged in a research process which has involved these forms of return, reconnection and consideration, where you have to remember, what was it that I asked, checking your research diary log, thinking through the questions that really prompted the beginning of your research and how they've changed as you've gone through the research. We know there's a big body of scholarship that demonstrate how different researchers in the same study, looking at the same data, will nevertheless generate different insights. So there's all sorts of epistemic removes that occur within formative study contexts. And anybody involved in large or longitudinal studies know that the analyses or the findings of studies and the conducting of them absolutely depends on researchers returning to their data over long periods of time. So there are always degrees of proximity and distance in research. And you'll have heard me using this word remove. And I think that's because the language of QSA necessitates this language of remove. What sorts of remove might we have from our research? And what sorts of analytic affordances might different sorts of remove provide in the conducting of qualitative secondary analysis? So in other words, what's enabled when we're not there in the moment? What new things can we find? What new observations are enabled precisely because we're reapprehending, we're approaching data in different ways from how we originally approached it, or from the originating researchers when we are not part of the originating team. And I think that one of the exciting things about this is that this language is that it begins to engage us with questions around data and evidence, and how data are rendered as evidence through researcher engagement. Now, this really isn't a hard and fast distinction, because I think data are conceived as a form of evidence anyway. But I like the language of evidence because it's really active. It requires us to examine all the different ways researchers render interview talk as certain kinds of evidence, and how these data can be repurposed through different ways of engaging with it. So, but as I said, data are always being made, they don't speak for themselves, and we are always remaking them as forms of evidence to address new kinds of problems in QSA. So when we raise this question, is remove in QSA exclusively a source of deficit? My answer is no, absolutely not. So now I'm going to go through in the second part of the presentation, which is providing this worked example of QSA in order to demonstrate how we might harness these analytic affordances, the sorts of things that we can gain in QSA through these different degrees of proximity and remove. And I'm going to bring them together using an example of what I call configurative QSA. There's lots and lots of terminology. I wouldn't worry about it. But this is part of a piece of work that I did with Dr. Anna Tarrant and Professor Jason Hughes. And what I will say is that I met Anna in a workshop in Prague in 2013, and we identified that we shared some scholarly interests, and our working relationship has developed there. We didn't know each other, and we've increasingly worked together in a range of ways. And Jason Hughes is my brother, and he's a sociologist as well. So you can imagine that our family dinners are really fun things with lots of sociological talk all over the place and arguments and things like that. And we've been engaged in a whole range of sociological debates for decades, actually. And this piece of work that I'm going to talk about now was prompted by some arguments that we were having, because Jason was leading on a paper that was examining the claims or the arguments of the radical critique and the ideas of interview society. And the ideas that he was dealing with and that we were engaging with there was that interviews are so much part of so much cultural trope, and the narratives that are produced in them, they cannot be read off simply as a truthful expression of people's thoughts and feelings, and as this sort of truthful account. It's another form of naive realism, over this sort of direct reading off what it is that people say. And in actual fact, it's so infused with narrative tropes that the best way to understand interviews is through discourse analysis. So working at a very specific epistemological remove, or epistemic remove, where in actual fact the thoughts and feelings are put to one side, and instead what we look at is what sorts of performances occur in interviews, and how interviews might be a form of performance, and that's where we may restrain our analyses. And while I absolutely agree that how people talk in interview is always mediated and must always be understood in contexts, I felt a certain degree of indignation that people's accounts were sort of being sidelined in terms of what it is that they were trying to convey in interview. And again, for all of you who have conducted qualitative interviews, you'll know that people get very emotional in interviews. They're very moved. They're really, I mean, people are phenomenally generous, I think, in research. They bring you in. In the UK, they give you lots of cups of tea, and they tell you about their lives. They really share. They really share stuff. So our preoccupation at the time was around: is it possible that we can only analyse interview talk in terms of its form as an interview, as part of interview society, that we can only do really discourse analysis on the sorts of narrative tropes that are being performed in it? And if not, if we want to engage with the content of interviews, but not in this naive, realistic sort of way, how might we do so? And in our conversations, I said to Jason, you know what, I've got this absolutely fantastic data set that's going to help us explore some of these ideas. And it's a data set that I was involved in. It comes from a study I was involved in a number of years ago with Jill Valentine, who led on this study, looking at problem internet gambling and the role of the family. And the study was looking, it developed these life history cases, which was a first interview with a self-identified problem internet gambler, and then a follow-up interview with them. And also in the case, there would be a one-off in-depth interview with a significant other or a partner. So the original study produced 69 interviews, but because of GDPR, the university erased some of the key shared drives. And although I've got the entire data set in paper, there are ethical constraints about sharing. And, you know, I was in Leeds, Jason's in Leicester, and as in Lincoln, you can't start sending transcripts all over the place. But I did have a core set of 28 interviews in digital format, and it was those that we shared. So we created a new team. We were looking, we were interrogating the ideas about form and content in interviews in the context of ideas, you know, addressing questions raised by the radical critique on qualitative interviews. And we went back to the formative study findings. And in that study, we established that it was really difficult to identify what problem internet gambling was, or even what internet gambling might be, because there were so many activities that were involved in it, from like sports betting, online poker, online bingo, slots, a whole range of things. And when in people's interview accounts, what they described as the problem internet gambling, such as the debt, also in their accounts migrated to another sort of problem, particularly things like betrayal of trust. So often in people's accounts of when you know, they disclose their internet gambling, it was usually because of a crisis around money. So there's lots of crisis management. But as time went on and the debt had been managed, what often happened was that family members would say, I can't believe you did that to us. I can't believe you got us into that amount of debt and that you were hiding that from us all that time. So what it was problematic, even within the interviewing in the families, was quite difficult to define. And what we observed was that defining problem internet gambling and dealing with it, it requires significant ongoing emotional work within intimate relationships. So these were the things that we identified in the original study. But we also had a lot of unexpected findings in the study. And the field worker, the woman who was conducted all the interviews, Charlotte Kenton, came back after the first few interviews and she was really disconcerted. And she said, you know what, people are telling me that they agreeing to be interviewed because they're finding it therapeutic and they think it's a pleasanter alternative to group therapy. You know, she's also really concerned because they're saying, well, I'm doing this interview because it was a bit of a cry for help. They were using interviews to rehearse their stories, getting their story straight so that they could disclose it to other family members. And also they were developing these cautionary tales about, you know, well, if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone, but I'm not seeing my story out there. So they were telling their tales to researchers because they wanted their stories to get out there for policy and the public more generally. And we discussed these findings in the originating team, but we never really published on them. But it was these sorts of findings that I said to Jason.
Escolta, carinyo, resulta que fem una assignatura optativa a medicina.
Please,
I believe someone has the
speaker on.
Somebody's...
I will ask Sonia to mute everybody, except Kahryn.
Me. That's the problem. I thought somebody might be asking for a little bit of clarity or something there.
I don't think so. Go
really
ahead.
Not a problem at all. But it was these sorts of findings that really flagged up this particular data set as useful for the research that that Jason and Anna and I were doing. I was saying, well, you know, interviews as therapeutic, the sorts of narrative tropes that are in these interviews, addiction and so on and so forth, you know, really lent itself to this question of whether talk in an interview can only be analysed in terms of its form, or whether it can also be analysed in terms of its content. And it's really important at this point to say that at that time, narratives of addiction were really predominant in the framing of problem internet gambling. And there was a real difficulty in theories and services to support problem internet gamblers and policy around it, working out what they were using the language of non-substance addiction, and it was newly emerging, and it was a really, again, it was a really contested area, and nobody was quite clear on very much. But the language of addiction was absolutely predominant in talking through problem internet gambling. So were these participants' descriptions of interviews as therapeutic also just expressive of how we conducted the study? What might it tell about interviews? So what extent were the data expressive of the contents of their becoming? And for us, the question for qualitative secondary analysis was also, could we use these data in ways that would enable us to speak beyond the context of their becoming? You know, were we able, given that Jason and Anna were not primary researchers and I was working at a considerable remove, were we able to reuse these data for different sorts of questions, different sorts of purposes? So I've got two data extracts that I'm going to look at very quickly. So we've got Dennis here. Dennis had, you know, you'll see from this extract, he had a float, meaning an ongoing sum of money that he uses all the time, which is £70,000 that he uses to bet with. That's his sort of basic deposit, and he always has around £70,000. He pays for a very comfortable lifestyle, financially enormously comfortable, and he contacted the research because he wanted to correct us. What he wanted to say was, well, you know what, internet gambling isn't always problematic. So he was really motivated to be involved in the study to sort of counter some of the debates and even what he saw to be the framing of our research around problem internet gambling. But have a look at this. He says, well, I've got a programmer who works for me and it's my income, but even so, it has to be really tightly controlled. I have no access to any of my own money because I can't trust myself, basically. We've got this float of about £70,000 that we bet with, meaning himself and the programmer, but I have access to virtually none of it. My wife has to talk to my programmer and he moves the money for me. The great thing is the people, my brother, the programmer and my wife, are all monitoring this. And when we looked at Dennis's interview more generally, we had a look and he presents both an addicted sort of identity, a self out of control, where he talks about, I can't trust myself, at the same time as talking about a self in control by giving other people control of his money. So his success isn't necessarily only equated with financial success. It's also the success of recognizing when he is and isn't out of control and being out of control, and that being out of control is the problem. So the internet gambling isn't a problem for him, it's the being out of control. And it's internet gambling can't be a problem because he's given control to other people. So this being out of control thing doesn't even come in. What's really fascinating about this extract is that these sorts of discourses of addiction being out of control are simultaneously reinforced because he draws on them, or that's where the problem is. But then they're also repurposed to show that the very recognition of being out of control is a basis for being in control, and therefore not a problem internet gambler. And Dennis's interview was endlessly fascinating in this regard. So, you know, Dennis makes a living out of internet gambling, and a very, very good one. Whereas Flora, she experienced a loss of £70,000 in UK currency within an intensive 3-month period. And she contacted the research in order to provide this cautionary tale that I mentioned earlier, because she was saying, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And in this extract, Flora is expressing something of what it feels like to be a problem internet gambler, but she also sets some limits to this. So, money loses all sense of any value. It becomes like monopoly money, and you're not aware that you've spent £500, for example. You're just not aware of it. You just carry on and carry on and carry on. And I don't think it's exactly, you know, it's not the amount you're winning. The adrenaline is flowing like mad. And I've always thought I was quite a sane person. And to be caught up in it, that's just beyond my comprehension why it should happen to me. And if it can happen to me, you know, a person who's relatively sane, then, you know, it could happen to anyone. So Flora invokes these narratives or these discourses of sanity that sit alongside these felt experiences. And the felt experiences were really, really predominant in debates around how, you know, a practice such as internet gambling could be addicted. And there were all these debates at the time about adrenaline and oxytocin and these physiological, these felt experiences that underscore, that really are like the drivers of this addicted experience. So she's describing her experiences using these sorts of narratives. But at the same time, she's pushing away from them, using narratives of sanity and using this time-bounded sense. Well, it was a moment. She normalizes herself. I've got a typing error there. I do apologise. So we approached these interviews. What happened when we came to these data as a new team and as a at a remove. So one of the things was we were able to observe that the narrative accounts stood at a moment when people needed to talk about their internet gambling as problematic. And they hadn't really had the opportunities to do it before. And that was the basis on which they described interviews as therapeutic encounters. So that was in terms of the content, what people were saying. So here, what I want to move on to is the affordances of the different sorts of remove that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to start with the affordances of relational move. What new things were we able to observe at a relational remove when we came back to this data? So we built a new research team in a new social context. Even though I was part of the originating team, I stood very much in a very different relationship to the data, to the other members of the team and to the participants of the study. When I went back, I really couldn't recognise a lot of the interview transcripts that I had originally analysed intensively. I just didn't remember the data at all. We recast these findings from the original research to not ask new questions of the data. So we brought these questions of why were people thinking about the interview as therapeutic? Is this just solely referring to the form of the interview, or can we use the content of the interview, and how might this be? So we looked at how participants responded to the framing and the style of the question, but also how the content of their talk spoke to processes and things beyond the interview counters. So we, as I said, we observed how people found few opportunities to talk about interview gambling, and that made interviews appealing. With Dennis and Flora, you can see how people navigated these discursive tensions in the policy context of the time. And these new questions, recasting these data in new ways, enabled us to observe in different ways what it was that people do in interviews. And you'll begin to see that I'm beginning to introduce the language of time and temporality. So I'm talking about relational, temporal, and epistemic remove. But I would really like to stress that these aren't different things. These are just different ways of analytical approaches of understanding what sorts of remove we might interrogate, and what sorts of analytic opportunities that thinking in those ways might provide us. So this epistemic remove, coming with new questions, we were able to see the study and the interviews as a particular undertaking at a particular moment. So these lack of opportunities to talk about their experiences, and a lack of policy at the time that really adequately addressed their problem internet gambling, stimulated or prompted people to develop these cautionary tales. And when we read through the cautionary tales, we were able to see how participants were fighting to move beyond these discourses of addiction, or the idea even, in Dennis's, well, these discourses of problem and the existing narrative tropes of the time. And when they were constrained, participants reached beyond what was out there in terms of existing explanations of problem internet gambling, existing definitions, and they were incredibly creative in talking them through. So what we observed was a dance of form and content, how narrative tropes both constrained and enabled people to provide accounts of their experience. So it's neither one nor the other, but it's both combined. And I was already introducing the language of time in that one as well. So what are the affordances of temporal remove? So, well, we were able to see how the data were of their time. For example, we were surprised at the surprise of the original research team at how they were surprised at how many gambling activities were involved in internet gambling, because that's become far more apparent. And in fact, the opportunities for internet gambling have exponentially exploded over the last 20 years. It's been one of the biggest global growth industries. Also, in the early 2000s, we were really focused on offline and online behaviours and practices, whereas we know in 2020, when we came back to these data, We were really aware that you might be in a football stadium watching a football match, but using a smartphone at the same time to get the odds for the next player to score after half time, and then placing a bet before that happened. So you might be, you may have put a bet on before you went into the football stadium as well. So you might be engaging in gambling. This thing about offline and online, simply that distinction doesn't work. And again, I'd invite you to think about what it is that we're doing at the moment. And also what we observed was that the interviews could speak beyond themselves about processes of change, that we were able to observe what people were preoccupied with at the time, but also reflexively how debates had moved on and how we were different at a different moment, observing those data. So really briefly, temporal remove allows us to look at how data travel through time, and so do we, and that temporal remove offers all these comparative opportunities. This thing around relational move, and this is really where I go as well, this is the direction, which is getting us to think about rethink relationships in and of research. So it's not questions just about co-presence, and it's more about these longer relational histories and broader research constituencies of which we're a part. And these constituencies, members of these, or the participants in these, are researchers or users of the research, the participants and other scholars. And I use this language of data stewards that was developed by Bren Neal and Libby Bishop, which is particularly in the context of QSA, all those people that are involved in the production and reproduction of those data. So, people like participants, but also people who manage data archives and repositories, who curate those data in ways that make it possible for other people to reuse them. And then maybe decades on, 20, 30, 100 years down the line, people who are reusing those data also have a responsibility of stewardship towards those data. All these different people have different sorts of responsibilities. They're all different stewards of data at different times. And then epistemic remove pushes us to think through new questions that have emerged since the formative research across theoretical developments and empirical insights in the changing knowledge landscapes and the changing evidentiary terrain of our disciplines and the world more generally. So what does this tell us about QSA? Well, QSA relies on and reveals forms of analytic conversation that we have with each other. And the conversations that I've described in the empirical example entail this mode of configurative QSA, where theories and findings are refined and developed and extended through this concerted dialogue between theory and evidence. So these conversations are not solely a spoken conversation, but these are conversations of theory and evidence. And while the example that I give you is these are conversations in situ with each other at the same time, I'd also like you to think of the research that you are doing. Qualitative research is a conversation over time. These are longitudinal conversations of evidence, findings, theory, and developments of the social world over time. So for me, these problems about remove as being seen solely in terms of analytic deficit, I'd like to come back with this over-focus on the interview encounter, because I think that we do that all the time when we talk about reflexivity and the democratization agenda and asymmetrical power relationships in the research and research relationship. We always got this over-focus on this interview encounter as the sole crucible in which data are produced, or the sole crucible of particular sorts of data from which analyses can be derived. And for me, it's a retreat to the moment. It sort of takes time out of the mix, and I think that's the big problem. And I think it's a problem because it involves this disambiguation, this removal of the complex of relationships in place and over time within disciplines, across our social worlds that make up research processes and knowledge production more broadly. And I think that this over-focus is problematic because it blinds us to how we're always engaged in this analytic synthesis across different evidentiary terrains. And so this retreat to the interview as a sole moment that can tell about society, I think is really, really flawed, because research always involves different degrees of proximity and distance. And finally, I think what's really important about this is it changes our view of data, and it changes how we talk about it, because it forces us to shift from this preoccupation with questions about concerning these intrinsic qualities of data, what they are, and it pushes us to thinking through what our relationships with data might be. In other words, what we do with the data. Okay, I hope you found that of interest, and thank you. And I'd be really interested to have any of your questions.